Every great house keeps secrets. Some are hidden in locked rooms, in burned letters, in the careful silence of servants who have learned that knowing too much is dangerous. But Ashford Manor had a secret of a different kind. Its secret was alive. She woke before dawn each morning, pulled on worn leather gloves, and went out to tend the roses before anyone could see her face clearly in the light. She had been doing this for 7 years. She knew every stone path, every frost-damaged wall, every stubborn weed that always came back. She knew this garden the way a woman knows a place she has decided to disappear into quietly, without fuss, without anyone noticing. Her name was in the family Bible, right there on the last page, where all the Ashfords were recorded in careful ink: births, marriages, deaths. Next to her name, someone had written one word: deceased. She was not deceased. She was pruning roses. And on a gray morning in October of 1816, a carriage came up the long drive, and everything she had built from silence and invisibility was about to come apart. The carriage was too fine for the country roads. Alice noticed it from the far end of the garden near the old stone wall where the climbing roses had grown wild. She straightened, one hand pressed to her back, and watched it come. 4 horses, a crest on the door she didn't recognize, 2 outriders. She considered going inside. The sensible thing, the safe thing, would have been to set down her shears and disappear into the back of the house, the way she always did when strangers came. She had become very good at disappearing. But the first frost was coming, and if she didn't cut the roses back properly, they would be ruined by spring. So she stayed. She heard the carriage door open, boots on gravel, a man's voice, low, unhurried, giving instructions about luggage, then footsteps on the grass. She did not look up. "You there?" A pause. "The woman with the shears." Alice set down the shears, stripped one glove, and looked up. He was younger than she expected. Tall, dark-coated, with the kind of face that hadn't yet decided whether it was going to be handsome or merely severe. He was looking at her with the particular frown of a man who is certain he is being ignored on purpose and is not accustomed to it. He was right on both counts. "Are you the head gardener?" he asked. "There is no head gardener," Alice said. "There is only me." He looked at the roses, then at her, then at the roses again, revising some assumption he'd made. "I am Edmund Cavendish," he said. "I have purchased this estate." "I know," said Alice. "And you are?" The wind moved through the garden. Somewhere above them, a crow called once and fell silent. "I keep the garden," Alice said. It was not an answer. They both knew it. Edmund Cavendish held her gaze a moment longer than was comfortable. Alice held it back with the steadiness of a woman who had survived things this man could not imagine. And then he gave a short nod and walked toward the house. Alice watched him go. Then she pulled her glove back on and returned to her roses. She did not go to dinner. She never did when the house had occupants. She ate in the small room off the kitchen, at a wooden table with a candle, and whatever Mrs. Hodges had set aside. Above her, the new Duke and his staff moved through the house, voices, footsteps, crates being opened. Ashford Manor was waking up after years of half-sleep, and the sound of it was unsettling in the way all change is unsettling when you have organized your life around stillness. She went to bed early and told herself nothing had changed. A new owner. She had survived a new owner before. She closed her eyes. 3 floors above her, Edmund stood in the library. He hadn't meant to spend the evening going through old papers, but libraries told you what a family had valued, what they'd wanted to remember, what they couldn't throw away. Ashford Manor's library was melancholy, books unread for decades, dust on everything. A portrait above the fireplace of a woman with dark eyes and an expression of enormous composure, as though she had accepted some difficult truth and decided to carry it gracefully. The Bible was on the desk, not the shelves left there, perhaps forgotten. Edmund opened it out of habit. The family record was at the back, columns of names in different hands stretching back 200 years, births, marriages, deaths. He ran his finger down the last column. George Ashford, died 1812. Thomas Ashford, died 1814. And then near the bottom, in ink slightly newer than the rest, Alice Ashford, deceased. No date, no cause, just that one word written with unusual haste, the letters slightly uneven, as though the hand that wrote them had not been entirely steady. Edmund walked to the library window. Below, in the last gray light of evening, the garden was empty. But the shears were still lying where she had left them, beside the roses. And there were fresh cuttings on the ground. He looked at the Bible, then at the garden. Alice Ashford, deceased. The woman in the garden had not told him her name. Alice had not always been a woman who disappeared. There had been a time when she filled a room, not loudly, not with the brittle brightness of girls taught that charm was a survival skill, but with something quieter and more dangerous. A sharp mind, a steady gaze, the confidence of a young woman who believed the world intended her well. She had been 22 when she learned otherwise. It had begun, as so many disasters do, with money. Her father, George Ashford, owner of a respectable estate and a spectacular talent for losing at cards, had spent Alice's childhood dismantling everything his own father had built. Quietly at first. A mortgage here, a sold field there. Small dignified surrenders from a man who always believed his luck was about to turn. It never turned. By the time Alice was old enough to understand the shape of their situation, the shape was not good. The estate was leveraged to its foundations. Her brother Thomas had tried and failed to improve matters through investments that Alice could have told him, had anyone asked, were obviously foolish. No one had asked. She was a daughter. Daughters were not consulted about investments. They were asked to pour tea and wait. Alice had poured tea. She had waited. And then Lord Fenwick had come to dinner. He arrived in November, when the house was cold because they could no longer afford to heat all the rooms. He was 61 years old, enormously wealthy, a widower 3 times over, which the county regarded as unfortunate, and Alice, watching him across the dinner table, regarded as a pattern worth examining. He had small eyes that moved around a room the way certain animals move, always calculating the distance between themselves and everything else. He looked at Alice the way a man looks at a property he is considering purchasing. She understood, before the soup was finished, exactly why he had come. Her father called her into his study the following morning. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. He did not have the decency to reconsider. "Lord Fenwick has expressed an interest," he said. "It would be a very advantageous match." "He is 61 years old," Alice said. "He has buried 3 wives. Our situation requires a practical solution. And I am the practical solution." He had the grace not to answer that directly. Alice stood in that study and looked at her father, this man she had loved, who had taught her to read and called her his cleverest girl, and felt something shift inside her. Some last remaining faith in the idea that love is enough to protect you from being used. "I will not marry him," she said. Her father looked at his desk. "You will." She did not. What happened next required the cooperation of exactly 2 people. Mrs. Hodges, the Ashford housekeeper since Alice was born, whose loyalty was stronger than Alice had any right to expect, and Father Brennan, an elderly Irish priest in the nearest village who had known Alice's mother and regarded the entire arrangement as a perfectly reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. The plan was simple, and not without a certain grim humor. She would go, quietly in the night with a small bag and what little money Mrs. Hodges had set aside from the household accounts. She would go to the sisters at St. Margaret's, 2 counties away, where Father Brennan had connections. Her father would tell Lord Fenwick she had taken ill, then taken a turn for the worse, then, when enough time had passed, died. The largest problem with this plan was that it required Alice to be dead for the rest of her life. She had decided, at 22, staring at Lord Fenwick's small eyes across a dinner table, that this was preferable. St. Margaret's had been tolerable. The sisters were kind and asked few questions. Alice worked hard, caused no trouble, and learned the discipline of a life stripped of everything unnecessary. She had also, gradually, understood she could not stay forever. She was not built for permanent enclosure. She was built for open air and difficult problems and the specific satisfaction of making things grow. And she was haunted by one thought she could not pray away. The garden at Ashford will go to ruin without someone who knows it. She went back in the spring of her 3rd year away. Quietly, arriving before dawn, slipping through the kitchen where Mrs. Hodges had left the door unlatched. She stood in the garden in the early gray light with her eyes closed, breathing the smell of it. She had meant to stay 1 week. She had stayed 7 years. It had been easier than it should have been. Her father was dead by then, and Thomas not long after. The estate had passed through several sets of hands. New owners came, found the house damp and the grounds neglected, and left. Alice made herself part of the landscape, which is easier to do than people imagine when you are officially dead. The servants who remained were the ones who had known her before. They kept her secret with a loyalty she could not repay. Mrs. Hodges had built an elaborate architecture of silence around Alice's existence, referring to her, when pressed, as the garden woman. No surname, no questions encouraged. It had worked. Until now. Alice lay in the dark and thought about the new Duke. He had looked at her the way a person looks at a puzzle, curious, attentive, not unkind. Nothing like Fenwick's assessing, acquisitive stare. She thought about the Bible on the library desk. She had seen it there earlier in the week, open. She had not looked at which page. She thought about her name written in her father's hand, the word beside it. Deceased. She thought, I should leave. She thought, I always think I should leave. She thought, the roses are not finished. Somewhere above her in the library she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, a man thinking hard about something. She pulled her blanket tighter. She did not leave. Edmund Cavendish had not built his reputation on ignoring things that didn't add up. He had inherited the dukedom at 26, younger than anyone expected, and spent the 8 years since learning that the difference between a man who manages a great estate well and one who ruins it is almost never intelligence. It is almost always attention. He paid very close attention. And what he saw at Ashford Manor on his 2nd morning did not add up at all. He started with the staff. 5 of them remained from the previous arrangement. Mrs. Hodges, the housekeeper, a substantial woman with the expression of someone who has outlasted several catastrophes and expects to outlast several more. 2 housemaids, a groundsman named Peters who was approximately 90 years old and pretended to be deaf when questions became inconvenient, and a young footman called William who had not yet learned that the correct response to a direct question is not a rapid sideways glance at Mrs. Hodges. Edmund noted the glance, carefully. He began with Mrs. Hodges. The woman in the garden, he said, over the household accounts she had brought him. Who is she? She keeps the garden, Your Grace. Her name? She goes by Nell. Nell what? A fractional pause. She has never offered a surname, we have never pressed her. How long has she been here? Some years. How many? Several, said Mrs. Hodges, and closed the accounts with an air of finality that would have discouraged a less determined man. Edmund thanked her pleasantly and went to find the woman in the garden. She was at the far wall again, working methodically through the climbing roses with the focused patience of someone who finds the work itself sufficient company. She heard him coming. He was certain of it, but did not look up. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, Your Grace." She knew his title. He hadn't mentioned it yesterday. "You know who I am," he said. "The estate has a new owner. The rest was not difficult to determine." She moved along the wall, shears working. "Is there something you require?" "Your name." "I told you yesterday, I keep the garden." "That is what you do," Edmund said, "not who you are." She stopped cutting, just for a moment, a pause so brief he might have imagined it. Then the shears moved again. "They are much the same thing at this point," she said. It was an odd answer, not a deflection, more like a truth she hadn't intended to say aloud. Edmund filed it away. He tried several more approaches. Where she was from, how long she had been here. Each answer technically true, utterly uninformative, delivered without apparent evasion. It was a practiced art. You didn't develop that kind of precision in a few months. He changed direction. "The glass house on the east side," he said. "The orchids, they're an unusual variety, labeled in Latin." He paused. "In handwriting that doesn't match any of the current staff." The shears paused. "Just for a second, just long enough." "I labeled them myself," she said. "I have some Latin." "Housekeepers' daughters don't generally have some Latin," Edmund said pleasantly. Alice turned and looked at him for the first time since he'd approached. Her eyes were a dark gray, the color of sky before serious weather, and they were currently regarding him with an expression that was approximately 40% composed and 60% something she was working hard to conceal. "Your Grace," she said, perfectly respectful and somehow still suggesting this conversation had gone on long enough. "I have a great deal of work to finish before the frost. If there is nothing specific—" "There is nothing specific," Edmund said. "I am simply curious." "Curiosity," said Alice, "is best directed at things that concern one." She turned back to the wall. Edmund stood a moment longer, looking at the straight line of her shoulders, the stillness held in place by considerable effort. Then he nodded to no one in particular and walked back to the house. He spent the afternoon in the estate papers. Decades of records, rents, repairs, correspondence, legal documents. The Ashford family declining in the ledgers with the slow, painful clarity of arithmetic. And then, tucked into a folder dated 1809, a single sheet. A letter from a firm of London solicitors regarding the settlement of Alice Ashford's affairs following her. The letter used the word *demise. It referred to property questions arising from the death of a minor heir. It noted that some documentation was incomplete. Dated October 1809. Edmund looked at the orchid house through the window. He thought about Latin labels, about a woman who chose her words with the careful precision of someone who had learned that carelessness has consequences. He went to the Bible. Alice Ashford deceased. No date, no witness, no doctor's signature, nothing of the kind that always accompanied a genuine death record. Just that word in George Ashford's handwriting. He recognized it now, having spent the afternoon with the estate papers. A father had written his daughter's death in the family Bible. Edmund poured himself a brandy. He stood at the window. Below, Alice was still working, the kitchen garden now, pulling the last autumn vegetables, movements unhurried. An entirely ordinary woman, part of the landscape. Except, after 5 minutes, she straightened and turned to look at something on the garden wall, a bird perhaps, and for a moment her face was unguarded, completely unguarded, and Edmund saw, in that brief moment, something he hadn't seen before. Not the careful blankness she maintained when observed. Something older, the specific weight of grief that has been carried a very long time. She looked at the house, the way you look at something that once belonged to you. Edmund stepped back from the window before she could see him watching. He finished his brandy. He thought, I am going to need to be very careful about this. He went to the orchid house the following morning early, before she would be in the garden. He walked the rows slowly, reading the small labels, careful Latin, detailed notes on soil mixtures and flowering seasons, all in the same handwriting. At the end of the row, one plant stood apart, older than the others, its pot worn and repaired along one edge, its label smaller, the handwriting younger, less formed. Mother's favorite, do not move her. The paper was old, the ink faded. This label had been written by a child. He found her at the stone wall, exactly where she had been every morning. He waited at the garden's edge, then walked across the grass. I went to the orchid house this morning, he said. The last plant on the left. The label is older than the others, written before the handwriting had fully developed. He looked at her. But it is recognizably the same hand as all the others. Alice set down the shears. She turned to face him, more composed than he had ever seen her, which meant he was learning that what was underneath was the least composed it had ever been. What is it you want, Your Grace? Very quietly. The truth, Edmund said. I think you know which truth. The wind moved through the garden. The roses shivered on the wall. Alice looked at him for a long moment, measuring something, weighing something, with those gray eyes that had seen far more than a garden woman had any business seeing. Then she looked away. Ask your question plainly, she said, and I will decide whether to answer it. Edmund nodded. The woman listed as deceased in the Ashford family Bible, he said. Where is she? Alice Ashford looked at the house where she had been born, and the garden she had come back across 7 years to tend. She opened her mouth, and from the end of the drive came the sound of carriage wheels on gravel. They both turned. The carriage was black. The crest on its door Alice recognized immediately, with a cold, dropping sensation she had not felt in 7 years. Lord Fenwick. She was moving before she knew she had decided to. Do not, Edmund said sharply, run. She stopped. She made herself stand very still, back to the arriving carriage, and breathed. There are men who age into kindness. Lord Fenwick was not such a man. He had been 61 when Alice last saw him. He was 68 now, and the years had not softened him, they had condensed him, the way certain substances become more potent when reduced. Thinner than she remembered. The flesh had retreated from his face and left the bone more visible, and the effect was not of frailty, but of something stripped down to its essential nature. He stepped out of the carriage and looked at Ashford Manor with the expression of a man arriving somewhere he has always considered, on some level, to be his. Alice stood at the garden wall and did not run. She was not entirely sure how. Edmund moved to intercept him before Fenwick reached the house, crossing the drive with the unhurried ease of a man on his own property. Lord Fenwick, I was not expecting a visitor. Cavendish. Fenwick's voice was smooth, measured, with something beneath it like a stone floor beneath thin carpet. Forgive the intrusion. I make it a habit to welcome new neighbors personally. I have the estate at Wycliffe, 4 miles east. I know it, please come in. They went inside. Alice released the breath she had been holding. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold stone of the wall. Then she picked up her shears and went back to work, because there was nothing else to do, and because the roses still needed cutting, and because she had survived 7 years by refusing to let fear make her stupid. Inside, Mrs. Hodges managed the situation with the efficiency of a general who has anticipated this particular battle. Tea appeared. The good parlor was opened. Fenwick was installed in the best chair with the careful hospitality that English country houses extend to visitors they do not entirely want. Edmund sat across from him and listened. Fenwick talked about the county, the roads, the hunting, the neighboring families, all delivered with the precise detail of a man who has spent considerable time studying the landscape he moves through. He was charming in the way that very dangerous things are sometimes charming, smoothly, convincingly, in a way that made you feel the charm rather than observe it. Edmund observed it. He also observed the moment, approximately 12 minutes in, when Fenwick glanced toward the window overlooking the garden. A brief glance, casual, the kind a man gives a view when he is pretending not to look at something specific in it. Edmund did not follow the glance. He kept his eyes on Fenwick. "You kept the Ashford servants on," Fenwick said. "Loyal of you. They know the house. That knowledge is valuable." "Indeed." Fenwick turned his cup in his hands. "Though I understand the previous owners had an unusual arrangement with one of the garden staff, a woman, rather outside the normal way of things." Edmund allowed a moment of silence. "The garden has been well maintained. I have no complaints." "No, I imagine not." A small smile. "Still, for a property of this standing, one wants certainty about who is on the grounds, their backgrounds." "Perfectly," said Edmund. Alice saw them come out 40 minutes later. She had positioned herself near the kitchen garden, close enough to observe, unremarkable enough to be overlooked, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path curving around the side of the house. She did not look up. "A fine property," Fenwick said, somewhere behind her, addressing Edmund but positioned she understood to see her face. "The grounds especially." Footsteps closer now. Alice kept her hands moving in the soil. "Good morning," Fenwick said. She sat back on her heels and looked up. She had prepared for this. 40 minutes to arrange her face into the expression of a woman with nothing to conceal, mild, slightly dull, the look of someone who finds the world generally uninteresting. She held that expression for exactly as long as it took Lord Fenwick's small eyes to move across her face. And then she saw it. The slight narrowing, the fractional stillness, the rapid recalibration of a man who has seen something unexpected and is deciding, very quickly, what to do about it. He knew. Not with certainty, she could see the uncertainty running beneath the recognition like a current beneath ice. But enough to be dangerous. "Good morning," she said, flat, unremarkable. Fenwick smiled. It did not reach his eyes, it never had. Lovely morning for it. He gestured at the turned soil, then turned back to Edmund, and the conversation moved on. Alice turned back to her work. Her hands were entirely steady. She had learned, over 7 years, to be very good at steady hands. Mrs. Hodges came to Alice in the preserve room that evening. She sat down across the small table, folded her hands, and said, "He told His Grace you were a thief." Alice set down her fork. "He said you were employed in his household some years ago, that you took several items of value before disappearing, that he thought His Grace ought to be informed in the spirit of neighborly concern." "And what did His Grace say?" "He thanked Lord Fenwick for his concern, said he would look into the matter." A pause. He said it in a way that Lord Fenwick appeared to find satisfactory. Alice understood. Edmund had given Fenwick the shape of agreement without the substance of it. Whether that meant anything in her favor, she couldn't yet tell. "What else?" she said, because Mrs. Hodges still had the look of someone who hasn't finished. "Lord Fenwick has been invited to dine on Friday. He accepted." Alice absorbed this. "He will come back," she said. "He will keep coming back." "Yes," said Mrs. Hodges. I believe that is the intention." They sat together in the small room, the candle between them, the old house settling around them in its familiar language of creaks and sighs. "He recognized me," Alice said. "I know. Not certain enough to stake everything on, but enough." Mrs. Hodges nodded slowly. "What do you want to do?" Alice thought carefully, not with the first instinct, which was panic, nor the second, which was flight, but the third, slower instinct that had kept her alive for 7 years. "I want to finish cutting back the roses," she said. "After that, I don't know." Mrs. Hodges stood and straightened her apron, the small, precise gesture Alice had watched since childhood. "I'll leave the kitchen door unlatched tonight," she said. "In case." "In case you need to run," she did not say. They both heard it anyway. Alice went to bed. Past midnight, she heard footsteps on the floor above the library. The same slow, deliberate footsteps from 2 nights ago, a man thinking hard. She stared at the ceiling. A thief. That was the story Fenwick had given, specific enough to be credible, vague enough to be unanswerable. How do you disprove that you stole something 7 years ago from a man prepared to insist that you did? You cannot. Not without explaining who you actually are, and that would open doors she had kept closed for 7 years. She thought about Edmund's face when he had said, "Do not run." Not suspicion, not the face of a man who has decided what you are, the face of a man still deciding. She rose before dawn, dressed, pulled on her gloves. She was reaching for her shears when she opened the kitchen passage door and found Edmund Cavendish standing in it. Fully dressed, holding a candle, looking at her with the relentless directness she was beginning to recognize as simply how he looked at things. "I owe you a conversation," he said. "I believe you were about to owe me one as well." Alice looked at the kitchen door at the end of the passage, the one Mrs. Hodges had left unlatched. Then she looked at Edmund. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "it is 5 o'clock in the morning." "Yes," he said, "I am aware." He stepped back, gesturing toward the kitchen. "Shall we?" Alice stood in the passage for a long moment. Then she took her hand off the door and followed him. The kitchen at 5 in the morning was the most honest room in any house. No performance in it, no arrangement, just the cold stone floor and the banked fire and the silence of a room that has not yet been asked to be anything other than itself. Edmund filled the kettle without asking where it was. He set it over the rebuilt fire with the competence of a man who had, at some point, done things for himself. He did not speak immediately. Alice sat down at the table and waited. "I am going to tell you what I know," Edmund said, still facing the fire. "And then I am going to ask you one question. I would like an honest answer." "That depends on the question." "It usually does." He turned. "I know that Alice Ashford was recorded as deceased in the family Bible in 1809, no date, no witness, no official documentation. I know the orchid house contains plants labeled in a hand that has been writing in this garden since childhood. I know your Latin is too precise for the education available to women in service." He paused. "And I know that you look at this house the way people look at things they have lost." Alice said nothing. The kettle began its slow building toward a boil. "Lord Fenwick told me you are a thief," Edmund continued. "He told me this in the careful way of a man who has prepared a story rather than remembered one. The details were too neat, the concern too neighborly." He looked at her steadily. "I have met Lord Fenwick's kind before. They speak in complete sentences when a man telling the truth would stumble." The kettle whistled. "My question," Edmund said. He reached into his coat and placed the family Bible on the table between them. Open to the last page, her name, that word. "Is this you?" Alice looked at her name. At asterisk deceased asterisk in her father's handwriting, the ink faded now to dull brown, sealing her into a death she had not died. She looked up. "Yes," she said. The word dropped into the kitchen silence like a stone into still water. Simple, irrevocable, the first time she had said it aloud in 7 years. Edmund turned, took the kettle from the fire and made the tea. He set a cup in front of her, sat down across the table, wrapped both hands around his own cup and waited. So Alice told him. Not everything, but the shape of it. The dinner, her father's study, Fenwick's small assessing eyes, and the choice that had not felt like a choice at all. The months at St. Margaret's. The return. The years of making herself invisible in the house where she had grown up, tending the garden, keeping the orchids alive, being officially dead while being entirely, stubbornly present. She told it plainly, without decoration. She looked at the table while she talked. It was easier than looking at him. When she finished, the kitchen was fully light. The sun had come up somewhere in the middle of her story, and neither of them had noticed. Edmund had not interrupted once. His tea was cold and untouched. He looked at the Bible, still open between them. Then he reached out and turned it over to the back cover and stopped. "Did you know about this?" he said. He turned the Bible back toward her. On the inside of the back cover, where the old glue had dried and the end paper had lifted away from the board, was a folded piece of paper, small, yellowed, in handwriting Alice recognized before she even touched it. Her father's hand, older than the Bible entry, shakier. Her hands were not steady as she unfolded it. It was not a long letter. Her father had never been a man of many words when the words mattered. "Alice, if you are reading this, you have come home. I knew you would come home. I built you in this garden, and I knew you would come back to it regardless of what I had done. I have done a terrible thing. I told myself it was the only thing. I have spent 3 years trying to believe that, and I no longer do. Fenwick is not what he presented himself. I learned this after too late. He is not a man who wanted a wife. He is a man who wanted a signature. Your grandmother's land to the east of the Wycliffe border, the deed is in your name by the terms of her will. Fenwick knew this. A marriage would have given him access to it. Your death, he believes, has given him the opportunity to acquire it through other means. Do not let him. There is a copy of your grandmother's deed in the green tin box in the library's east wall, behind the Herodotus. It has always been behind the Herodotus, because your grandmother said that no man who would steal from a woman would bother to read Greek history first. I am sorry, Alice. I was a coward and a fool, and I loved you more than I knew how to show, which is the most useless kind of love, and I know it. Come home. Your father asterisk. Alice read it twice. Then she set it down very carefully, and pressed both hands flat against the table and did not speak. Edmund did not speak either. Outside, the garden was filling with morning light. The roses on the south wall caught it first, the way they always had, the way she had watched them every day for 7 years. Come home, her father had written. She had never left. She felt, to her considerable annoyance, that she was going to cry. She did not. She pressed her hands harder against the table and looked at the window and breathed. Edmund picked up his cold tea, stood, and carried it to the sink, giving her the privacy of his turned back. The Herodotus, he said, in a conversational tone, as though discussing something entirely ordinary. East wall of the library. Apparently, Alice said, her voice was steady, she was proud of it. I believe I saw it yesterday, second shelf from the top, a pause, behind a rather ugly candlestick. My grandmother had no patience for ugly candlesticks. She would have put it there deliberately. Sensible woman. Extraordinarily. Edmund turned back. The deed, if it says what your father believed, Fenwick's entire purpose yesterday was not a courtesy call. No, Alice said, it was not. He wanted to confirm you were here, and now he knows. Edmund's expression was controlled, but beneath it something that was not calm at all. Friday is 3 days away. Before then, we need to find the deed, establish its validity, and determine what legal ground you are standing on. Alice looked at him. He said asterisk, we with the ease of a man who hadn't noticed he said it. Your Grace, she said slowly, this is not your problem. Edmund looked at her with an expression that was perfectly polite and utterly unconvinced. A woman has been living on my estate under a fraudulent death record. A neighbor is attempting to acquire her property through coercion and forgery. A pause. I find I am not comfortable calling that someone else's problem. Alice studied him carefully, looking for the interest beneath the stated reason, the want beneath the offered help. She could not find it, which was itself a kind of answer. The Herodotus, she said finally. The Herodotus, Edmund agreed. They went to the library. The green tin box was exactly where her father had said. Alice climbed the library steps, reached behind the Herodotus. There was indeed an ugly candlestick, bronze, with a grimacing face she remembered hating as a child, and her fingers found the tin immediately. She set it on the desk, opened it. Inside, folded in oilskin against the damp, was a document. Legal, formal, precisely drafted. Alice's grandmother's name at the top, Alice's name below it. The land described in careful detail, acreage, boundaries, a map drawn in the margin in her grandmother's own confident hand. At the bottom, witnessed and sealed, Alice Margaret Ashford, sole inheritor. Edmund read it over her shoulder in silence. This is valid, he said. Yes. Fenwick cannot acquire this land legally while you are alive. Which, Alice said, is why I have been dead. Edmund straightened. She watched his face move through something, not calculations exactly, decisions. He will come Friday, he said, and he will have decided by then that he is certain enough. Yes. Then Friday is dangerous. Yes. Edmund met her eyes. I will not let him touch you, very simply. Not a declaration, a statement of fact, offered in the same tone he might use to report the state of the East Field. Alice looked at him. No one had said anything of that kind to her in 7 years. You don't know me, she said. It came out more quietly than she intended. No, Edmund agreed, but I know enough. He looked at the deed and the letter, set carefully together on the desk. I know your grandmother hid your inheritance behind a book she trusted no one worth worrying about would bother to read. I know your father loved you enough to leave you a map back to yourself. He paused. And I know you have spent 7 years keeping this garden alive when any sensible woman would have left and built a different life somewhere. He looked at her. That is not nothing, Miss Ashford. Alice looked at the deed, at her name on it, at the grandmother she had never known well enough, who had seen something worth protecting and protected it in the most stubbornly characteristic way imaginable. We should make a plan, she said. Edmund almost smiled. We should. 3 days is both a very long time and no time at all. A very long time when you are waiting for something dangerous. No time at all when you have a great deal to do before Friday. Alice threw herself at the doing. The first day was for the deed. Edmund sent a rider to London before breakfast, a man he'd brought from his own household, not one inherited with the estate. The rider carried a letter to Edmund's solicitor, a man named Cartwright, who was apparently both brilliant and discreet, 2 qualities rarer in combination than they ought to be. The letter asked Cartwright to research, with all available speed, the legal standing of the Ashford land grant, and what happened to property held in the name of a woman whose death record could be demonstrated to be fraudulent. What do you expect him to say? Alice asked. That it is complicated, but workable. You sound certain. I am not certain, but Cartwright, when given a problem he finds interesting, produces results that would astonish a less experienced solicitor. A pause. I wrote him a very interesting letter. The second day was for understanding Fenwick. Not the man himself, but the architecture of what he wanted, which Edmund, once he examined it properly, found considerably more elaborate than a simple land grab. It began with Alice's grandmother. Margaret Ashford had married into the family at 18, watched her husband spend 30 years making ill-advised financial decisions, and responded by quietly ensuring that anything she'd brought into the marriage remained legally hers. The land to the east of the Wycliffe border had been her dowry. She had made certain, with a solicitor she retained independently, that it passed directly to Alice, not to Alice's father, not to her brother Thomas, but to Alice, specifically, by name. Margaret Ashford had not trusted the men in her family with anything she valued. The land had one weakness. If Alice was dead, officially, uncontestably dead, it reverted to the nearest male heir, a distant cousin who had, 6 months after Alice's recorded death, entered into an agreement with Lord Fenwick to sell him the land at a considerably reduced price. He arranged it before he was even certain she was dead, Edmund said, looking at the letter he'd found between Fenwick and the cousin's solicitor, tucked into a folder considered too dull to examine closely. He moved quickly. He assumed George Ashford's word was sufficient. My father was a respected man, Alice said flatly. No one questioned the death record. Exactly. The agreement was signed, but it has never been completed. Edmund set the letter down. Fenwick's solicitor raised a technical irregularity in the original deed, required further documentation to resolve. Alice understood immediately. He couldn't complete the transfer without producing documents that would reveal the deed's terms clearly. And resolving it quietly required time. Edmund's expression was controlled, but beneath it a contained anger she was beginning to recognize. He has been waiting 3 years. Then the estate sold. A new owner might easily find documents he would prefer remained unfound. He looked at her. And someone told him there was a woman in the garden who had been there for years and would not give a surname. Alice sat back. The full shape of it settled over her like a cold hand. He didn't come to welcome you to the county, she said. No, he came to see if you were here. And if you were, he needed to act before I found the deed. Edmund's voice was even. A man who has held an incomplete fraudulent arrangement in place for 3 years is not a man who will let it slip away quietly. Alice thought about the night garden, about how completely alone she had been for 7 years, about the paths she walked in the dark when she couldn't sleep, with no one knowing she was there at all. Mrs. Hodges, she said. I have spoken to her. Edmund met her eyes. She will not be alone in the servants' quarters any night this week. The 3rd day was the longest. Alice went to the garden in the morning as she always did, because routine was its own form of armor. She finished the roses. She put the tools away one by one in the stone shed, in the places they had always lived, the places she had learned as a child, watching the gardeners her father employed when there was still money for gardeners. She stood in the shed for a moment in the smell of damp earth and old metal. She had been keeping this garden for 7 years as though it would never end, as though the seasons would keep coming and the roses would keep needing cutting, and nothing would ever have to change. She had been wrong. Edmund found her there. Cartwright's reply came, he said. And he used the word interesting 4 times in 2 pages. For Cartwright, that is practically exuberant, the almost smile. The fraudulent death record, if we can demonstrate it as fraudulent, invalidates Fenwick's agreement with the cousin entirely. The land never legally transferred. It remains yours. He paused. You would need to appear before a magistrate, the record corrected. It would not be a quiet process. No, Alice said, it wouldn't. There would be attention, questions about where you have been, the family's history examined. My father is dead. He cannot be hurt by it. Thomas is dead. She looked at the tools on their hooks. The only person with anything to lose is me. Edmund said nothing. He waited. Alice picked up her grandmother's trowel-cracked handle, the letter M engraved on it, worn smooth by decades of use. She turned it in her hands. "When I was 6, she said, my grandmother gave me this. She said, a garden teaches you that some things die and some things go dormant, and a great many people cannot tell the difference." She looked at Edmund. "I have been dormant, not dead. I have always known the difference, even when no one else did." She set the trowel down. "I would like to stop being dormant now." "Then we will do what needs doing," Edmund said. He reached into his coat and produced a letter sealed, addressed in his own hand. "I wrote to the magistrate this morning," he said. "Justice Alderley, a friend of my father's. He will be at dinner on Friday." Alice stared at him. "You invited the magistrate?" "I invited an old family friend," Edmund said, with deliberate precision, "who happens to be the regional magistrate, who will happen to be present when Lord Fenwick arrives for what he believes will be a private dinner with a neighbor he can manage." Alice looked at the letter. She thought about Fenwick's small eyes, about 3 years of waiting, about a deed hidden behind a book her grandmother had chosen because she understood perfectly what kind of men she was dealing with. "He will know," Alice said. "When he sees Alderley, he will know something has changed." "Yes," Edmund said, "he will, and then it will depend on what he does next." He met her eyes. "I am prepared for several possibilities. Which are you prepared for?" Alice looked at the garden through the shed's open door. The roses cut back properly, the paths clear, the orchid house glinting in the pale afternoon light. "All of them," she said. "I am prepared for all of them." Edmund nodded. He stepped back from the doorway, making room for her to pass. Alice walked out of the shed and into the cold October afternoon. She did not look back. That night she did not sleep, not from fear, but from the particular wakefulness of someone who has made an irreversible decision and feels the world reorganizing itself around it. She lay in the dark and listened to the house. Above her in the library, footsteps, slow and deliberate, Edmund still awake, still thinking. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Friday. She thought, "I have been afraid of that moment for 7 years." She thought, "I am still afraid." She thought, "I am going to do it anyway." She closed her eyes. She did not sleep, but she rested. Which was enough. Lord Fenwick arrived at precisely 6 o'clock. He was a man who believed in punctuality the way he believed in most things, not out of courtesy, but strategy. Arriving exactly on time announced that you had not hurried and had not lingered, that you were, in all things, precisely where you intended to be. He stepped out of his carriage, straightened his coat, and looked up at Ashford Manor. The house looked back at him, lit from within, windows warm against the early dark. He went inside. Alice watched from the upper landing. She had positioned herself in the shadow of the gallery, above the entrance hall, where she could see without being seen. An old habit, 7 years of perfecting the vantage point. She watched Fenwick hand his coat to William, watched those small eyes move around the entrance hall, taking inventory, the paintings, the furniture, the quality of the candlelight. Then, through the open parlor door, he saw the drinks tray. 3 glasses, not 2. His step did not falter, but she saw the slight adjustment in his bearing, the subtle realignment of a man recalculating. He went into the parlor. Alice counted to 10. Then she descended the stairs. Edmund was standing by the fireplace when Fenwick entered, and beside him, positioned with the casual naturalness of a man who simply happened to be there, stood Justice Henry Alderley, 65 years old, heavy in the comfortable way of men who have eaten well for many decades, a broad, plain face that had learned over 40 years on the bench to give nothing away. "Fenwick," Edmund said, Good of you to come. You know Justice Alderley, I believe." Fenwick stopped. Not dramatically. The stop of a man who has found the furniture arranged differently than expected. A fractional hesitation, quickly covered with the smooth machinery of long social practice. "Alderley, every appearance of pleasure. It has been some time." "It has," Alderley agreed, with the measured warmth of a man who has decided nothing yet and intends to keep it that way. "Cavendish tells me you have been a good neighbor already, coming to call so promptly." "One likes to know who one's neighbors are," Fenwick said. "Indeed," said Alderley, "indeed one does." Edmund poured 3 glasses. They talked about the roads, the hunting, the county, filling time before something they were all aware of but none had yet named. Fenwick managed himself beautifully. Nothing in his face or manner to suggest that a magistrate's presence was anything other than a pleasant surprise. Nothing to suggest that his mind was not, underneath the performance, running very fast indeed. He was good. Alice had always known he was good. Edmund glanced toward the door. Not at her directly, no signal, no gesture. Simply a glance, in the way a man glances at something he is aware of without needing to draw attention to it. It was enough. Alice stepped into the parlor. She had prepared for many things. Fenwick's reaction, Alderley's questions, the legal machinery that would begin to grind once the truth was in the open. She had not prepared for how it would feel to walk into a room as herself. Not Nell, not the garden woman, not the invisible presence haunting the edges of her own life. Alice Ashford, in the house where she had been born, standing upright in the candlelight. The feeling was not triumph, not relief, something more complicated, a painful wholeness, like a joint returning to its socket. She looked at Fenwick. Fenwick looked at her. The parlor was very quiet. "Miss Ashford," Edmund said into the silence with absolute composure, "I am glad you could join us." As though she had simply come down from elsewhere in the house, as though nothing about this moment required explanation. It was, Alice thought, a masterful thing to say. Fenwick's face did something complicated. The progression rapid and largely concealed, recognition, calculation, the swift assessment of a man determining how much he had lost and how much remained salvageable. His expression settled, finally, into something wearing the shape of confusion. "I'm afraid I don't," he began. "Lord Fenwick," Alice's voice was steady, "I believe you do." Silence. Alderley, beside Edmund, had gone very still, looking between Alice and Fenwick with the focused attention of a man who has just understood that what he was told he was coming to is not what he has come to at all. He did not look displeased. He looked interested. What followed was not a scene. Alice had feared a scene, raised voices, ugly denials, but Fenwick was too experienced for scenes. His composure held, and the next hour was something stranger and more difficult, a conversation. Alderley led it with the practiced ease of a man who has conducted difficult conversations in rooms where everyone is pretending to be comfortable. He asked gently, methodically, with the deceptive mildness of a man whose mildness is a professional instrument. He asked Fenwick about the land agreement with the cousin. Fenwick said he had simply been trying to assist with what he understood to be an uncomplicated transfer. Alderley asked about the solicitor's concern regarding the deed irregularity. Fenwick said these were technical matters left entirely to the lawyers. Alderley asked whether Fenwick had been aware of the terms of Margaret Ashford's original bequest, the specific provision naming Alice. Fenwick said he may have been, in a general way, but with Alice Ashford deceased, he had naturally assumed. "Yes," said Alderley pleasantly. "That does seem to be the question, doesn't it? The deceased Miss Ashford." He looked at Alice, sitting across the room with her hands folded and her gray eyes fixed on Fenwick with a steadiness that had taken 7 years to build, who appears to be very much present. Fenwick looked at Alice. Alice looked at Fenwick. "There has clearly been some confusion," Fenwick said, smooth, controlled. "I am delighted, of course, to learn Miss Ashford is alive. Wonderful news." "Wonderful," Edmund said from the fireplace. He had said very little all evening, standing with his glass, watching, with the patience of a man who has laid a trap and is simply waiting. "Miss Ashford's existence does, of course, render the land agreement void, as I'm sure your solicitors will confirm." Fenwick turned to Edmund. For the first time, something cracked in the surface. Not a collapse, a hairline fracture, visible for a second before it was repaired. "That will require examination," Fenwick said, "by the appropriate parties." "It will," Alderley agreed, "and I shall see to it promptly." He set down his glass. "Along with certain questions regarding the circumstances of Miss Ashford's recorded death. No date, no witness, no medical attestation. The pleasantest possible smile. I'm sure that's simply a clerical matter." Fenwick said nothing. "Shall we go in to dinner?" Edmund said. Dinner was the strangest meal Alice had ever eaten. The food was excellent. Mrs. Hodges had outdone herself, which Alice understood as 7 years of accumulated feeling expressed in the form of a particularly fine roast. They talked about things that were not the thing they were all thinking about, in the English way that treats the avoidance of difficult subjects as a form of civilization. Fenwick ate very little. Alderley ate enthusiastically, and told 2 long stories about his grandchildren that were genuinely funny and made Alice, against all probability, laugh. Edmund watched Fenwick. Alice watched Edmund watching Fenwick, this man who had orchestrated the entire evening like a piece of music, every element placed, every timing considered, with a calm so complete that only someone watching very carefully would see the effort beneath it. She thought about what it meant that he had done this, not because she was his tenant or his legal responsibility. She was neither, technically. He had done it anyway. She looked at her plate and thought about that, and did not entirely know what to do with it. Fenwick left before 10. He made his excuses gracefully, shook Edmund's hand, nodded to Alderley with the correctness of a man who knows the game has changed and is recalculating. At the door he looked at Alice once more. She had expected anger, or cold calculation. Instead she saw something that looked, briefly and uncomfortably, like defeat. The deeper defeat of a man who has understood that the tools he has always relied on will not work here. That there is something in this room, in Edmund's quiet steadiness, in Alderley's pleasant implacability, in Alice's simple, unanswerable presence, that he has no instrument to deal with. He left. The carriage rolled away down the drive. Alderley put on his coat in the entrance hall and looked at Alice with the expression of a man who has understood more than he was told. "Miss Ashford, I shall require a formal statement, at your convenience." He buttoned his coat. "Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman. I knew her slightly." A pause. "She would have been satisfied with this evening, I think." He went out into the cold. The door closed. Edmund and Alice stood alone in the entrance hall. "He will not give up entirely," Alice said. "He has resources for a prolonged legal." "He does, and we will deal with that as it comes." Edmund looked at her. "But tonight, I think we may allow ourselves to note that it went rather well." Alice looked at the closed front door, at the candle-lit entrance hall of the house where she had grown up. "It went rather well," she agreed. Edmund's expression shifted, more serious, the look of a man who has been waiting to say something and has decided the moment has arrived. "There is one more thing," he said. Alice looked at him. "Your legal situation, even with Alderley's involvement, even with the record corrected, it will be a long process. You will need, he stopped. Tried again, which she noted because Edmund Cavendish did not generally need to try twice. The process will be considerably simpler if you have a current and legally unassailable name under which to bring the claim. Alice was very still. I have a name, she said, Alice Ashford. An excellent name, also currently recorded as deceased, which will complicate matters until the record is corrected, which will take time, during which you are legally. Precarious, Alice supplied. Precarious, he agreed. Silence. You are suggesting, Alice said slowly, that a different name would simplify the legal situation. A married name, for instance, would be. Resolved, Alice said. Yes. And this someone, she looked at him carefully, is this a theoretical someone? Edmund looked at her, not with the composed expression she had come to know, not the careful orchestrating calm, but simply and directly, with the look of a man who has decided to say the thing. I have destroyed my peace of mind worrying about you for 3 days, he said. I have invited a magistrate to dinner and staged an ambush in my own parlor. I have written what Cartwright will certainly describe as the most interesting letter of his career. He paused. I do not generally do these things for women I have known less than a week. We have known each other less than a week, Alice said. Yes, it is, he searched for the word. Inconvenient, she offered. Very, Edmund agreed. Alice thought about a woman who had organized her entire life around invisibility, who had made herself so thoroughly a ghost that she had sometimes, in the long quiet nights, wondered if she had actually died somewhere along the way and simply not noticed. She thought about a man who had stood in a kitchen at 5 in the morning and waited for the truth. Miss Ashford, Edmund said, will you? Yes, Alice said. He stopped. I haven't finished the question. I know what it is. The answer is yes. He looked at her for a long moment. You are, he said finally, the most direct woman I have ever met. I spent 7 years being indirect, Alice said. I find I am done with it. For the first time, the first real time, not the almost smile she had seen before, Edmund Cavendish smiled. Fully. It changed his face entirely, made him look younger, made him look like himself. She thought, I would like to see that more often. She thought, I think I might. The letter arrived Monday morning. Alice was in the orchid house when Mrs. Hodges brought it, checking the plants for cold damage that crept in at the joints of the glass panes overnight. She read it standing there, among the orchids, with soil on her gloves. It was from Fenwick's solicitor. 6 pages, every sentence technically courteous, every paragraph a blade wrapped in silk. It challenged the validity of the original deed on 4 separate grounds. It questioned Alice's identity, suggesting formal verification would be required before any legal proceedings could be initiated. It raised the question of whether a death record entered into a family Bible by the head of the household could be unilaterally disputed by a claimant whose identity was, at this stage, unverified. And buried in the 5th page, almost in passing, the way a skilled advocate buries the most dangerous thing. It noted that the land had been under Lord Fenwick's effective stewardship for 3 years, during which he had made significant improvements at considerable personal expense, and that any disruption to this arrangement would naturally require. Alice stopped reading. She set the letter down on the potting bench. Then she picked it back up and went to find Edmund. He read it at the library desk without expression, beginning to end. When he finished, he set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man making a conscious decision not to do something else with it. The identity question, he said. Yes, he is suggesting that any claim I make is inadmissible until I can prove I am who I say I am, which requires exactly the process that proving my identity is meant to initiate. Alice sat down across from him. It is a very elegant circle. Cartwright will say it is a standard delay tactic. Edmund tapped one finger on the letter. Fenwick knows he cannot win on the substance. He is making the process expensive enough and long enough that settling becomes easier than fighting. He looked at her. What evidence exists of your identity beyond the Bible entry itself? The orchid labels handwriting analysis. The staff, Mrs. Hodges Peters, my father's letter. The letter is unsigned and undated. Servant testimony he will call paid loyalty. Edmund stood and moved to the window. We need something Fenwick cannot easily dismiss. Something that establishes your identity independently of Ashford estate records, which he will argue are compromised. Alice looked at the orchids through the library window. Father Brennan, she said. Edmund turned. The priest who helped me. He knew my mother, knew me as a child, facilitated the arrangement when I left. He is the one person who has always known the death record was false. She paused. He is in his 80s, but he was in good health 4 years ago. If he is willing. He will be willing, Alice said. He has carried this secret for 7 years because he believed it was right. I think he has been waiting for someone to come and ask him to set it down. I will send someone today, Edmund said. I will go myself. Edmund looked at her. He is old, Alice said, and I have not. I should go myself. She met his eyes. I have been letting other people carry things that are mine to carry. I think that is also something I am done with. A pause. I will come with you, Edmund said. Not because you require assistance. I simply prefer not to send you alone into a situation Fenwick may also have considered. Alice looked at him. She thought about arguing. She found she did not particularly want to. Very well, she said. They left the following morning. The journey took most of the day, the roads poor and the weather indifferent. They talked the way people talk on long journeys when they are no longer strangers but not yet whatever comes after, carefully at first, then less carefully, then not carefully at all. Alice learned that Edmund had inherited at 26 unexpectedly when his father and older brother died within 6 months of each other. That he had spent 8 years since learning the weight of responsibility by carrying it. That he had bought Ashford Manor because he had seen the garden in a painting, a small landscape, poorly executed but specific, with the south wall roses in the foreground, and had thought, someone loved this garden very much. I would like to know what that means. Alice looked at him when he said that. You bought a manor house because of a painting of the garden, she said. It was a very specific painting, he said, with perfect seriousness. What was the painting? I have it. It was with the estate papers, painted by a man named Castleton, a previous owner. Alice was quiet. Old Mr. Castleton, he was here one summer, he painted constantly, he was terrible at it. She looked out the carriage window. He painted the roses from the library window. I used to watch him from the garden. He could see you, Edmund said. He never said anything. He painted what he saw. Edmund looked at her. A woman in a garden tending roses. That is why I bought the house. Alice sat with that. 7 years of careful invisibility, and a bad painter had seen her anyway. The painting had traveled from a dead man's estate to an auction house to Edmund Cavendish's attention. And then Edmund Cavendish had come up the drive in a carriage too fine for country roads, and she had been pruning roses, and here they were. Her grandmother, she thought, would have had something to say about that. Father Brennan was alive. 81 years old, largely confined to a chair by a window, and the most alert 81-year-old Alice had ever encountered. He looked up when she came through the door and his face did something that was not surprise. He had been expecting this. She understood, in some form, for some time. Alice Ashford, he said, God be thanked. Edmund waited in the hall while Alice sat with Father Brennan for 2 hours. She told him everything. He listened with the absolute undivided presence of a man who believes that the story in front of him is always the most important thing in the world. When she finished, he was quiet a moment. "I should have come to you sooner," he said, "when I knew you'd gone back." He looked at her with faded blue eyes that had lost none of their precision. "But I thought, she'll come when she's ready. She was always stubborn." "I prefer determined," Alice said. "You would." He looked past her at the closed door. "The Duke." "Yes." "Bring him in." Edmund came in, shook the old man's hand, and listened while Father Brennan talked for 40 minutes. Alice's parents, her baptism, her childhood, the arrangement with St. Margaret's, and the letter he had written attesting to Alice's continued existence that he had kept in his desk for 8 years, waiting for the moment it would be needed. He produced it from the drawer with the satisfaction of a man who has been very patient for a very long time. It was notarized, witnessed by 2 men now deceased, whose signatures could be verified through the diocesan records. Edmund read it. He looked up. "You prepared this 8 years ago." 7 years and 4 months, Father Brennan said precisely. "When Alice went back, I thought, someone will need to know she is alive eventually. I should make it easy for them." "Thank you," Alice said. He waved a hand. "Thank your grandmother. She came to me 6 months before she died, said, 'The men in this family have good intentions and very poor judgment, and Alice will need someone paying attention.'" A pause. "I have been paying attention." Cartwright arrived the morning after their return, briefcase in hand, with the expression of a man who has found a situation fully as interesting as promised. He examined everything. Father Brennan's letter, the deed, George Ashford's note, the handwriting analysis. He looked at Edmund over his spectacles. "Fenwick's solicitor is very good, but he is working with a losing hand, and I believe he knows it." He set the documents down. "The identity question collapses with Father Brennan's attestation. The deed stands. The fraudulent death record is demonstrably fraudulent." He removed his spectacles. "There will be hearings. Fenwick will spend money and make noise, but he will not win." The hearing before Justice Alderley took place 3 weeks later. The county heard about it, as counties always hear about things, through the particular mechanism of information that moves along lanes and over garden walls and through kitchen doors and arrives, eventually, everywhere. They heard that the woman in the Ashford garden, keeping the roses for 7 years, was Alice Ashford, reported dead, very much otherwise. They heard that Lord Fenwick had been attempting to acquire her land through an arrangement predicated on that false report. They heard that the new Duke of Cavendish had stood up in Alderley's hearing room and said, in the unhurried way of a man who has considered his words and found them sufficient, "She may be listed as dead in every Bible in England. She may be recorded as deceased in every register this county holds, but she is standing in front of me, and that is all the proof I require." The room had been very quiet after that. Fenwick's solicitor made 2 objections. Alderley overruled both with pleasant implacability. The death record was declared fraudulent and ordered corrected. The land agreement between Fenwick and the cousin was declared void. Alice Ashford was declared, by the formal judgment of Justice Henry Alderley, to be Alice Ashford, alive, present herself. Afterward, Edmund came to stand beside her on the courthouse steps. The street was ordinary, a dog barking somewhere, someone selling something from a cart, the world continuing in its normal way, entirely indifferent to the fact that she had just been officially returned to it. "Cartwright will file the corrected record this afternoon," Edmund said. "Yes." "And Fenwick will go home and be very angry in private, and eventually accept the situation because he has no other choice." "He is a practical man," Alice said, "in his way." Edmund nodded. Then, carefully, There is still the matter of a conversation we began in an entrance hall some weeks ago. Alice looked at him. You said yes, he said, before I had finished the question. I stand by it. You haven't heard the question. I told you, I know what it is. Miss Ashford, something warm beneath the composure. You have just spent 3 weeks fighting for your name, your own name. I would not ask you to give it up without asking properly. Alice looked at him. You are not asking me to give it up, she said. You are asking me to add to it. Edmund was quiet a moment. That is exactly what I am asking. Alice looked at the gray November sky. She thought about roses cut back properly for winter, ready for spring. About a man who had bought a house because of a bad painting of a garden and found a dead woman in it and decided, without obligation, without advantage, that her existence was worth defending. She thought about her grandmother, who had hidden a deed behind a Greek history book and given a 6-year-old girl a trowel and said, "Some things die and some things go dormant, and a great many people cannot tell the difference." She turned to Edmund. Then ask, she said. He asked. She answered. It was not a long answer, but it was, like everything Alice Ashford said when something mattered, entirely unambiguous. 1 year later, March came to Ashford Manor the way it always had, reluctantly, in fits and starts, with false promises of warmth followed by sharp reversals, the English spring conducting its annual argument with winter and winning only incrementally. There were mornings still cold enough for frost. There were afternoons that smelled undeniably of something beginning. Alice was in the garden before breakfast. She was always in the garden before breakfast. This had not changed. Edmund had accepted it with the equanimity of a man who had understood, from approximately the 3rd day of their acquaintance, that there were certain constants in Alice's life that were not subject to negotiation, and that the garden before breakfast was one of them. He had, in fact, stopped mentioning it. He had started, instead, coming to find her there. She heard him cross the grass. She always heard him now, the particular rhythm of his step as familiar as the sound of the house settling or the birds in the east wall, and she straightened from the rose bed and pulled off one glove and waited. He came to stand beside her, hands in his coat pockets, and looked at what she was looking at, the south wall roses. They had come back, not tentatively, not the cautious, provisional return of plants that are not sure they are welcome. Emphatically. With the particular vigor of things that have been properly tended through a hard winter and are expressing, in the only language available to them, something very much like relief, new growth everywhere. Green and insistent, pushing out from the old wood at every joint, reaching for the pale March sun with the undiscriminating ambition of all growing things. They're back, Edmund said. They were always going to come back, Alice said. I cut them properly. You always say that. It is always true. He looked at the roses for a moment, then he looked at her. She could feel it without turning the specific quality of his attention, which she had been learning for a year and still found on occasion slightly overwhelming. Not uncomfortably, simply more than she had been prepared for, more than she had known to expect. Cartwright wrote, he said. I know, Mrs. Hodges gave me the letter this morning. Alice stripped her other glove. Fenwick has withdrawn the final challenge. Yes, so it is finished. Legally, Edmund said. Yes, entirely finished. Alice looked at the roses. She thought about a word written in faded ink beside her name. About 7 years of frost and silence and careful, deliberate invisibility. About the specific loneliness of being a ghost in the place you loved most, and the specific difficulty of becoming real again after so long of being otherwise. She thought about Alderley's hearing room. About a man standing up in it and saying, in the unhurried way of someone who has found his words and found them sufficient, "She is standing in front of me, and that is all the proof I require." She thought about the family Bible, which was still in the library. She had not moved it, had not wanted to move it, open on the desk to the page with the family record. Open to her name, which no longer said deceased. Cartwright had arranged it with his usual quiet thoroughness. The correction was formal, documented, witnessed. The old entry remained, you could still see it if you looked, the ghost of the word beneath the careful line drawn through it, but above it, in a different ink, in a different hand, Alice Ashford Cavendish. Living. Alice had stood at that desk for a long time the day the corrected record came back. Edmund had stood in the doorway and not interrupted, which was the thing she had come to understand over a year, that he did best, the particular gift of knowing when presence was enough, and words were not needed. She put her gloves in her pocket. She looked at the garden, the full sweep of it in the pale morning light. The south wall roses and the kitchen garden and the orchid house with its fogged glass and the long path to the old stone bench and the east wall where the climbing plants would need attention in another few weeks. A full garden. A garden with work to do and seasons ahead of it and no shortage of things that needed tending. You are thinking something, Edmund said. I am always thinking something. You are thinking something, you are deciding whether to say. Alice considered this. My grandmother's trowel needs a new handle, she said. The crack has become impractical. Edmund looked at her. That, he said, is not what you were thinking. A pause. No, Alice agreed. It isn't. She looked at the roses one more moment. Then she turned to face him, this man who had bought a house because of a painting of a garden and found a dead woman in it and decided, without any particular logic she had ever been able to identify, that she was worth finding. I was thinking, she said, that I have spent a year being surprised by all of it. She made a gesture that encompassed vaguely the garden and the house and him and the general shape of a life she had not anticipated. I made very careful plans, you understand. When I was 22, about how things would go, what I would do and where I would be. She paused. None of it looked like this. Is that a complaint? Edmund asked. No, Alice said. It is an observation. He studied her. And what do you observe? Alice looked at the roses on the south wall, at the new growth, green and certain and entirely indifferent to the difficulty of the winter it had come through. At the evidence in every direction of things that had been tended properly and had come back stronger. I observe, she said, that I was dormant for a very long time and that I am not any more. She looked at him. And that I find I prefer it. Edmund said nothing for a moment, then, even the early mornings, especially the early mornings. He almost smiled. Then, as he did more often now, as the year had loosened something in him that she thought had been wound tight for a long time before she found it, he did smile. Fully. The one that changed his face entirely, she thought. I will never entirely get used to that, she thought. I am very glad of it. They walked the garden together in the early light, as they had begun to do, not every morning, not by arrangement, but often enough that it had become its own kind of ritual. He walked beside her, and she pointed out what needed doing, and he asked questions that were sometimes practical and sometimes not, and she answered both kinds with equal seriousness, and the garden received them both with its usual indifference to human affairs and got on with the business of spring. They stopped at the orchid house. Through the fogged glass, the shapes of the plants were visible, the careful rows, the individual pots, the particular one at the end that was older than the others, its pot worn and repaired, its label small and slightly faded, mother's favorite. Do not move her. She is putting out new growth, Alice said. Edmund looked at the plant through the glass. She does every spring. She was struggling when you arrived. The winter before you came was very cold and I was worried about the light on that side. Alice pressed her hand briefly against the glass, the old habit. But she came back. They all came back, Edmund said. They all came back, Alice agreed. She let her hand drop from the glass. She turned. The sun was fully up now, the garden bright and cold and sharp with March light, the kind of light that shows you everything clearly, the work still to do, the progress already made, the long season ahead. Edmund held out his hand. She took it. They walked back to the house together. Through the garden that had kept her alive when nothing else would, through the morning of a life she had not planned and could not have imagined, toward the breakfast that Mrs. Hodges would have ready and the letters from Cartwright and the 1,000 ordinary details of an ordinary day. Behind them on the south wall, the roses reached for the sun. The family Bible remained on the library desk at Ashford Manor for many years. Visitors occasionally asked about it, why it was left open, why not shelved with the other books. Alice never explained. She simply said it was a useful reminder. If they looked closely, they could see the old entry, the line drawn through it, the correction above. And below all of it, added in a different ink entirely, in a hand that was precise and unhurried and had been writing in that garden since childhood, Alice Ashford Cavendish, née Ashford, returned to life. October 1816. The garden is fine. Thank you for spending this time inside another story with us tonight. In a world of titles, silence, and secrets, some truths take far longer to reach the light than anyone expects. If this story stayed with you even for a moment, tell us which city you're listening from and consider subscribing for more Duke stories filled with drama, heartbreak, and impossible choices.